the daughter-in-law who became a demon. Summary section: in a haunting retelling, the daughter-in-law who became a demon delves into a tale where despair, treachery, and supernatural vengeance collide. Set in a remote, impoverished village, a young woman, Kiara, marries into the wealthy Leighton family, only to discover that she is trapped in a cycle of cruelty and sorrow. Her husband Marcus, a gentle soul but frail, succumbs to a mysterious illness. Kiara, heartbroken, is wrongly accused of theft and deceit by her vindictive in-laws. After a tragic series of events, including her husband's death, Kiara herself falls victim to an unspeakable fate. But death is not the end for her. She rises from the grave as a vengeful spirit, seeking justice against those who wronged her. As the Leighton family is haunted by Kiara's presence, they desperately seek ways to rid themselves of the demon they created. Yet Kiara's wrath is unstoppable, and one by one, the truth of her suffering and their guilt unravels in terrifying detail. The story unfolds in a chilling crescendo of suspense, horror, and karmic retribution as Kiara's curse grips the family, dragging them into the abyss. Part 1: Kiara's poverty and filial devotion. In the quiet, desolate village of Greymore, nestled far from the bustling city, life moved at a lethargic pace, much like the thick fog that clung to the hills. It was a place forgotten by prosperity, where the days felt like one continuous stretch of hardship. At the edge of the village edge, there stood a weather-beaten cottage, its roof sagging under the weight of years, and its wooden walls groaning with decay. Inside that cottage lived Kiara, a young woman no older than 25, with her frail mother-in-law, Bernice. Kiara had always been a woman of resilience, despite her circumstances. She had married into a family that promised her little beyond the looming shadow of poverty. Her husband had passed away only months after their wedding, leaving her alone to care for his ailing mother. Now, Kiara's life was a monotony of labor and worry. Each day she would rise before dawn to tend to their small patch of land, gather water from the nearby stream, and cook what little food they could afford. The sun never saw her rest. Bernice, once a woman of formidable strength, was now reduced to a husk of her former self. Her illness had sapped her energy, leaving her confined to the narrow, uncomfortable bed in the corner of their one-room home. The coughs that racked her frail body echoed through the walls, each one more violent than the last, as if her very soul were trying to escape her. Her face, gaunt and pale, looked more like a spectre than a living being. Despite the misery that hung like a cloud over their home, Kiara never let despair touch her face when Bernice was awake. She would smile, though her eyes betrayed the weight of her worry. Every time Bernice looked at her with those sunken, apologetic eyes, Kiara would say, "Don't worry, mother, I will take care of you, we'll find a way." But deep down, Kiara was terrified. She had tried every home remedy she knew, but Bernice's condition worsened by the day. The once vibrant woman was slipping away, and Kiara felt powerless to stop it. What gnawed at her most was the guilt that she couldn't afford proper care for the woman who had become her only family. One morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cottage walls, Bernice's coughing grew more violent than ever. Kiara rushed to her side, her heart pounding with fear. "Mother, are you alright?" she asked, gently lifting the older woman's head to give her a sip of water. But Bernice's breathing was labored, and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. I don't have much time left," Bernice wheezed. "Save your strength, child. There's nothing you can do." No, Kiara's voice cracked with desperation. "I refuse to accept that. There has to be someone who can help. A doctor, anyone." Bernice shook her head weakly, her hand clutching Kiara's with surprising strength. "We can't afford it. You know that as well as I do." But Kiara wasn't listening. Her mind was racing, her heart thudding with determination. She couldn't let Bernice die, not like this, not without a fight. "I'll find a doctor," she said firmly. "I'll get the money somehow." Without waiting for Bernice's protests, Kiara threw on her shawl and hurried out of the cottage, her boots sinking into the mud of the narrow path that led to the village center. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and earth, and the sky above threatened to break into a storm. But Kiara didn't care. Her only thought was to find help for Bernice. As she entered the village, her heart sank. Greymore was a place where everyone knew everyone, and more importantly, everyone knew Kiara's dire situation. The villagers glanced at her with pity or indifference, their faces as worn as the land they tilled. But pity would do her no good now. She knocked on the first doctor's door, her fingers trembling with both hope and fear. When the door opened, she found herself face to face with Dr. Reid, an older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for being as cold as the winter winds that blew through Greymoor. He barely glanced at Kiara before shaking his head. "I've told you before, girl. If you can't pay, I can't help you, please," Kiara begged, her voice breaking. "My mother is dying. I'll find a way to pay you, I swear." Dr. Reid sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Promises don't buy medicine, Kiara. I've got mouths to feed too," and with that, he slammed the door in her face. Kiara stood frozen for a moment, the sting of rejection like ice in her veins. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. She went from house to house, doctor to doctor, but the answers were always the same. No one in Greymoor was willing to help someone who couldn't pay. By midday, Kiara's feet ached, and her spirit felt as battered as the storm now brewing overhead. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, soaking her through as she trudged back toward the edge of the village. She had nothing. No money, no hope, and no idea how to save Bernice. Despair clawed at her chest as she collapsed on a bench near the market square. Tears mingled with the rain, and for the first time in a long while, Kiara let herself cry. She had failed. She had failed Bernice. The thought was unbearable. It was then that a shadow fell across her, and a soft voice spoke. "Are you all right?" Kiara looked up through the blur of her tears to see a tall figure standing before her. The man was dressed in fine clothes, though his eyes were kind, not haughty like the others who wore such garments. His dark hair was damp from the rain, but he didn't seem to mind. In his hand he held a black umbrella, which he moved to shield her from the downpour. I'm fine," Kiara stammered, though her voice betrayed her. She tried to compose herself, wiping her face with the back of her hand, but her tears kept coming. The man crouched down to her level, his expression soft with concern. "It doesn't look like you're fine," he said gently. "Is there something I can do to help?" Kiara hesitated, unsure if she should pour her heart out to a stranger. But something about his presence made her feel safe, as if for the first time in ages she didn't have to carry the weight of her burdens alone. "It's my mother-in-law," she finally whispered. "She's very sick, and I've tried everything, but no one will help us. We don't have money." Her voice broke again, the helplessness spilling over. The man didn't respond right away, but his eyes softened even more, and after a moment he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Here," he said, pressing it into her hands. "This should be enough to cover the doctor's fees and medicine." Kiara blinked, staring down at the pouch in disbelief. It felt heavy with coins, more than enough for what she needed. "I can't take this," she protested, shaking her head. "I don't even know you. How could I repay you?" The man smiled, his expression warm and sincere. "Consider it a loan, if that makes you feel better. My name is Marcus Leighton. I know how hard it is to care for someone you love when you don't have the means. I'd hate to see your mother suffer because of something as trivial as money." Marcus Leighton. The name struck a chord of recognition in Kiara's mind. He was from the Leighton family, the wealthiest in the village, but unlike the rest of them, Marcus didn't look down on her. He didn't treat her like she was beneath him. Instead, his gesture was one of genuine kindness. Kiara's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Marcus stood and helped her to her feet, the umbrella still protecting her from the relentless rain. "You don't have to thank me. Just take care of your mother," Kiara nodded, clutching the pouch tightly as if it were a lifeline. In many ways it was. She had been drowning in despair, but Marcus had thrown her a rope, and for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. As Marcus walked her back toward her cottage, Kiara felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, despite the storm that raged around them. She knew this wasn't the end of her troubles, far from it, but for now she had a chance. A chance to save the one person who had become her family, and with Marcus' help, she wouldn't let that chance slip away. But what Kiara didn't know was at this moment the act of kindness from a man she barely knew was the beginning of something far more profound and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. In the coming days, their fates would become intertwined in ways neither of them could foresee. And as the shadows lengthened over Greymoor, the storm brewing in the skies would be nothing compared to the storm brewing in their lives. Part 2. The growing relationship between Kiara and Marcus. After that fateful meeting in the rain-soaked village square, Kiara could not stop thinking about Marcus. His kindness had been a rare light in her bleak world of poverty and despair, a beacon of hope she hadn't known she needed until he appeared. The silver coins he had pressed into her hand that day had not just been money, they had been a lifeline, a gesture that reached far deeper than simple charity. Marcus, too, found himself drawn back to the image of Kiara, her eyes haunted with worry, yet still burning with quiet determination. There was something about her that lingered in his mind long after they parted ways, her spirit, her resilience. She was not like the others in the village, and certainly not like the women of his social circle who wore their privilege like a cloak. Kiara had the weight of the world on her shoulders, yet she still stood tall, refusing to bow under its burden. She was different, and Marcus found that difference intoxicating. In the weeks that followed, their paths seemed to cross more often than chance alone could explain. Kiara at first was hesitant, her gratitude for Marcus's help clashing with the growing unease she felt whenever she saw him. He was the son of the wealthiest family in Greymore, after all a man of high standing. She was nothing, just a poor widow caring for her sick mother-in-law in a crumbling cottage. Their worlds were too far apart, separated by more than just money. And yet, Marcus made it seem as though that gap didn't exist at all. He never treated her like someone beneath him. When he saw her at the market one day, struggling to carry a basket of vegetables, he rushed over to help, his warm smile banishing the unease that had crept into her heart. "Kiara," he greeted, his voice like the soft roll of thunder in the distance, deep and resonant. "It's good to see you again." Kiara's heart raced in her chest, her hands tightening around the basket handles. "Marcus, you don't need to do this. People will talk." Marcus shrugged, unbothered by the whispers that had already begun to swirl around them. "Let them talk. I don't care." She looked up at him, her brow furrowed with uncertainty. "You should care. We come from different worlds. You're not supposed to help people like me, and why not?" Marcus countered, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce intensity that made her pulse quicken. "People like you? You say that as if you're lesser than me, Kiara. But you're not. In fact, I think you might be stronger than anyone I know." The sincerity in his voice took her breath away, leaving her standing there, frozen in place, unable to speak. No one had ever looked at her the way Marcus did, with such admiration, such warmth. It terrified her, the way her heart seemed to leap into her throat whenever he was near. But it also made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. They spent the afternoon together in the village, their conversation flowing with an ease that surprised Kiara. Marcus told her about his family, about the expectations that came with being a Leighton, the weight of the legacy he was supposed to uphold. Kiara listened, her heart aching for him, even though she knew their lives were worlds apart. She had always thought the wealthy were untouched by hardship, but Marcus carried his own burdens, ones that had been hidden behind his easy smile and gentle demeanor. And in turn, she told him about her life, about Bernice, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. She told him about her late husband, a man she had cared for but had never truly loved. She spoke of the loneliness that had filled her days since his passing, and how she had grown used to the quiet desperation that had become her constant companion. Through it all, Marcus listened, his gaze never leaving hers, as though every word she said mattered to him more than anything else in the world. From that day on, they met often, sometimes by chance, sometimes by design. Marcus would find reasons to visit the market more frequently, always making sure to be there at the same time as Kiara. And she, despite her initial hesitation, began to look forward to seeing him. The moments they shared were fleeting, but they were enough to ignite something in her heart she had thought long dead. As summer melted into autumn, their meetings became more frequent, their conversations growing longer, more intimate. Marcus would walk Kiara home when she finished her errands, the two of them taking the long way through the village, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. The air around them seemed to hum with a quiet electricity, a tension neither of them acknowledged but both felt acutely. It wasn't long before the villagers began to notice. Whispers followed them wherever they went, eyes lingering a little too long on the sight of Marcus, the wealthy heir, walking alongside a woman like Kiara. It was a scandal waiting to happen, but Marcus seemed unconcerned. He had never cared much for the opinions of others, and he wasn't about to start now. Kiara, however, felt the weight of those stares, the judgment in every glance. She knew what people were saying, knew they thought she was taking advantage of Marcus's kindness. But what troubled her more than the gossip was the growing realization that her feelings for Marcus had deepened beyond mere gratitude. She had started to fall for him, and it terrified her. It was wrong, she told herself over and over again. He was from a different world, a world of wealth and privilege she could never be a part of. And yet, every time she saw him, every time he smiled at her, those fears melted away, leaving only the undeniable truth she was in love with Marcus Leighton. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Marcus and Kiara stood together on the hill overlooking Greymore. The wind carried the scent of earth and dying leaves, and the air was cool enough to make Kiara shiver beneath her shawl. "Are you cold?" Marcus asked, his voice low and filled with concern. "I'm fine," she replied, though the chill ran deeper than the weather. She was cold because she was afraid of what was happening between them, afraid of what it would mean if she let herself fall any further. But Marcus wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, shrugging off his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "There," he said softly, his hand lingering on her arm for just a moment longer than necessary. "That should help." Kiara looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of his coat a reminder of the chasm between them. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him that this couldn't continue, that they couldn't keep pretending their growing closeness didn't matter. But the words died in her throat as Marcus met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, his voice filled with a gravity that made her pulse quicken. Kiara swallowed, her throat tight. She knew what was coming, knew the confession that was about to spill from his lips. And yet she couldn't bring herself to stop it. "Marcus." "No, let me say this," he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until they were standing only inches apart, the fading light casting his face in shadow. "Kiara, from the moment I met you, I knew you were different. You're strong, resilient, and you carry yourself with a grace that people like me will never understand. I've tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that we come from different worlds, and it wouldn't work. But I can't stop thinking about you." Kiara's breath hitched, her heart hammering in her chest as his words washed over her like a tidal wave. She had known this moment was coming, had felt it building between them for weeks, and yet hearing it out loud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and desire. "I'm in love with you," Kiara continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't care about the differences between us. I don't care what people say. All I know is that when I'm with you, everything feels right." Tears welled in Kiara's eyes, a mixture of joy and sorrow swirling in her chest. She wanted to tell him she felt the same, that she had been falling for him ever since that day in the rain when he had given her more than just money, he had given her hope. But she couldn't. She couldn't let herself believe in something so impossible. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This can't happen. We can't happen." "Why not?" Marcus asked, his expression pained. "Why are you so determined to push me away?" "Because we come from different worlds," Kiara cried, stepping back as if to distance herself from the weight of her emotions. "You're Marcus Leighton, the heir to everything, and I'm nothing." "Don't say that," Marcus said fiercely, his hands reaching for hers, pulling her close again. "You're not nothing. You're everything to me." Tears spilled down Kiara's cheeks as she looked up at him, her heart breaking with the intensity of her love for him. "But it's forbidden, Marcus, you know that. Your family, they'll never accept me. We can't be together." Marcus's expression softened, and he reached up to wipe the tears from her face. "Let me worry about my family," he said softly. "All I care about is you." Kiara stared at him, her resolve crumbling under the weight of his words. She wanted so desperately to believe him, to believe that they could somehow make this work, despite the odds stacked against them. But the reality of their situation loomed over them like a dark cloud, threatening to snuff out the fragile flame of hope they had kindled. Still, as Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her close against the cool autumn breeze, Kiara let herself believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, love would be enough. But deep down, they both knew that the storm was only just beginning. Part 3. Marcus falls gravely ill. It started with a cough. At first it was nothing, a brief, hoarse sound that cut through the stillness of their conversations. Marcus would clear his throat, shake it off with a smile, and wave away Kiara's concern with a casual, "It's nothing, just a bit of dust, I suppose." But soon, the cough returned. It became more persistent, more insidious, creeping into their meetings until it was impossible to ignore. The sound, once soft and fleeting, grew sharper, deeper. Each time Marcus coughed, Kiara could feel it in her bones, a low thud of fear echoing through her heart. She tried to ask about it, tried to voice her concern, but Marcus remained as he always was, charming, dismissive, and ever so certain that nothing could be wrong. "Don't worry about me, Kiara," he would say, his eyes crinkling with that same reassuring smile. "I've never been sick a day in my life. Whatever this is, it'll pass." But it didn't pass. The cough worsened, and with it Marcus began to change. Kiara could see it in the subtle ways. At first his skin, once so vibrant, began to pale. The strength that had once defined his posture seemed to sag, his shoulders drooping ever so slightly. His voice, usually full of life, began to falter, replaced by a breathless whisper. And then there were the dark circles beneath his eyes, the way he leaned more heavily on her arm as they walked, the way he would pause mid-sentence to catch his breath, as if even speaking was becoming a burden. Despite his insistence that it was nothing, Kiara felt her heart sink deeper with each passing day. The fear inside her grew with a ferocity she hadn't known since her husband's death, that same gnawing terror that whispered of loss, of something slipping away beyond her grasp. But this time it was worse. This time it was Marcus, the man she had come to love, the man who had saved her from despair, who was slowly fading before her eyes. One cold autumn evening, as the winds howled through the village of Greymoor and the leaves scattered like whispers of death across the ground, Kiara visited Marcus at his family's estate. She had taken to visiting him more frequently now, her heart unwilling to stay away, even as dread clawed at her insides. The mansion was grand and imposing, a stark contrast to the crumbling cottage she called home. But it wasn't the size or wealth that intimidated her, it was the looming shadow of Marcus' illness that seemed to envelop everything, an invisible weight that pressed down on her soul. The servants who greeted her at the door wore tight-lipped expressions, their eyes averted as if they knew something she didn't, something terrible. They led her through the labyrinthine halls of the estate to Marcus's chamber, where the air was thick with a silence so heavy it was suffocating. Kiara hesitated at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that when she crossed the threshold, everything would change. And she was right. The moment she stepped inside, she was struck by how small Marcus seemed in the massive four-poster bed. His once tall, imposing figure was reduced to a fragile silhouette, barely more than a shadow against the pale linens. His skin was ashen, his lips dry and cracked, and his chest rose and fell with the shallow, labored rhythm of a man barely clinging to life. "Marcus," Kiara whispered, her voice trembling as she hurried to his side. He turned his head slowly, painfully, to look at her. His eyes, once so full of light and mischief, were now dull, clouded with the weight of his suffering. But even in his weakened state, he managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Kiara," he rasped, his voice a mere ghost of what it had once been. Tears welled in Kiara's eyes as she knelt beside him, taking his cold hand in hers. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You've been hiding this from me, haven't you?" Marcus, his smile faltered, and for the first time she saw the truth in his eyes. He had been hiding it. He had known, even before the cough had worsened, that something was wrong. But Marcus, ever the protector, hadn't wanted to burden her with the truth. He hadn't wanted her to see him like this, broken and fading. "I didn't want to worry you," he admitted, his voice weak but sincere. I thought I could fight it." Kiara shook her head, the tears spilling down her cheeks. "You don't have to fight this alone," she said fiercely. "I'm here. I'll always be here." For a moment, the weight of her words seemed to hang between them, heavy with the unspoken truth that they both knew this was a fight Marcus couldn't win. Days passed, and Marcus's condition continued to worsen. His family had called for doctors from the city, but none could offer more than empty reassurances and medicines that did little to ease his suffering. The once vibrant man who had stolen Kiara's heart was slipping away before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Kiara spent every waking moment by his side, her heart breaking a little more with each shallow breath he took. She prayed to God she didn't believe in, begged for a miracle, for anything that would save him. But the only answer was the relentless tick of the clock, marking the slow, inevitable passage of time. One night, as the fire in the hearth crackled softly and the shadows of the room danced with the flickering flames, Marcus stirred from his restless sleep. His hand, frail and trembling, reached for hers, and Kiara grasped it tightly, holding on as if her touch alone could keep him tethered to this world. "Kiara," he whispered, his voice so faint it was barely audible. She leaned closer, her heart aching with the effort to hold back her tears. "I'm here, Marcus. I'm right here." He smiled weakly, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man he had once been, the man who had made her laugh, who had walked with her through the village, uncaring of the whispers and the stares. But that flicker was brief, like the last gasp of a dying flame. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his words. "Don't," Kiara choked out, shaking her head. "Don't you dare apologize. I didn't want to leave you," he continued, his eyes filling with tears. I wanted us to have more time." Kiara couldn't hold back the sobs any longer. She clung to his hand, her tears falling freely as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. "You can't leave me, Marcus," she pleaded. "I need you. I love you." Marcus's hand tightened around hers, but it was a weak, fading grip. "I love you too," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I always will." And then with one final, ragged breath, Marcus's hand went limp in hers. His chest stilled, and the room was plunged into a suffocating silence. For a moment, Kiara couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. It was as if the world had stopped turning, as if the very air had been sucked from the room, leaving her gasping in the cold, crushing emptiness. "No," she whispered, her voice raw with denial. "No, Marcus, please, please don't go. Don't leave me." But he was gone. The man she had loved, the man who had brought light into her darkest days, was gone. And in that moment, Kiara felt as though a part of her had died with him. The days that followed were a blur of grief and numbness. The villagers whispered behind her back, their eyes filled with pity, but Kiara paid them no mind. She didn't care what they thought, didn't care about anything anymore. The world had lost its color, its warmth. Everything felt cold, distant, and lifeless, just like Marcus. She visited his grave every day, sitting in the cold earth, her heart a hollow shell of what it once was. She spoke to him as if he could still hear her, as if her words could somehow bring him back. "I don't know how to go on without you," she whispered one day, her fingers tracing the outline of his name on the headstone. "You promised me we'd have more time. You promised, but the only answer was the rustle of the wind through the trees, the quiet moaning of the earth itself." Kiara had always been strong, had always fought against the hardships life threw her way. But losing Marcus had broken something inside her, something that couldn't be fixed. She had lost the man she loved, the man who had made her believe that there was more to life than just survival. And in that loss, something dark began to stir within her, a seed of bitterness, of anger. The world had taken everything from her, and now it had taken Marcus too. She had nothing left, only the memories of the man who had loved her, and the hollow, arcing void where her heart had once been. The storm that had been brewing between them had finally broken, but it wasn't the one they had feared. It was far worse, a storm of loss, of grief, of a love torn away before its time. And in the wake of that storm, only darkness remained. Part 4, the betrayal by the Leighton family. When Marcus took his final breath, the world around Kiara collapsed. She had loved him with a depth she hadn't thought possible, and now that love felt like a curse, a gaping wound in her heart that would never heal. His death marked the end of everything good in her life, their stolen moments, their secret smiles, the future they had dared to imagine together, even though they both knew it was impossible. Dog for days after his passing, Kiara remained by his grave, kneeling on the cold, damp earth, her fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. The wind was sharp against her skin, but she didn't feel it. Nothing could pierce the numbness that consumed her. The Leighton family mansion stood ominously in the distance, the stone structure towering over the village like a silent sentinel. It had once been a place where Kiara found comfort, where she had dared to hope for something more than her life of poverty and despair. But now it loomed like a dark cloud, and the people inside had grown cold and distant. They had not invited her to the family gatherings after Marcus's death. They hadn't even spoken to her during the funeral, their faces pinched with hidden anger. At first, Kiara didn't notice. She was too consumed by her grief. But slowly, the whispers began to reach her ears, cutting through the haze of sorrow like knives. She never belonged here, she manipulated him. Look at her. How could Marcus have been so blind? The voices of the servants, the villagers, everyone seemed to unite in a chorus of disdain. But it wasn't until the day she returned to the Leighton estate, seeking refuge and perhaps even a shred of comfort, that the full weight of their betrayal crashed down upon her. As she approached the grand front doors, they opened not with welcome, but with malice. Two figures emerged from the shadows of the hall: Lord Thomas Leighton and Lady Eliza Leighton, Marcus' parents. They stood side by side, their expressions carved from ice, their once kind faces now twisted with contempt. The coldness in their eyes chilled Kiara more than the wind that swept across the moor. "Lady Eliza," Lord Thomas, Kiara began, her voice trembling as she clasped her hands together, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. I've come to see you. I wanted to speak about Marcus." But before she could finish, Lady Eliza raised a hand, silencing her with a single, sharp motion. "There's nothing left to speak of," Lady Eliza said, her voice cutting like broken glass. "Marcus is gone. And it is your fault." Kiara's heart stuttered in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. "My fault? No. How could you say that?" Lord Thomas stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing ominously on the stone floor. His eyes burned with a fury Kiara had never seen before. "You brought this upon him. You infected his life with your lies and your deceit. You brought death to this house." Kiara recoiled, her blood turning to ice. "I loved him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I would have done anything for him. I would have given my life to save him." Lady Eliza's lips curled into a bitter sneer. "Is that what you call it? Love? You took advantage of my son's kindness, wormed your way into his life. And for what? To drain him of everything: his health, his wealth, his spirit? That's not true." Kiara cried, tears welling in her eyes. "Marcus was sick. There was nothing I could do. I prayed, I begged for him to get better, but it was beyond me. You had to believe me, but there was no warmth in their gaze, no trace of sympathy or understanding. The love she had once thought they shared for Marcus was gone, replaced by something far darker: hatred, resentment, and suspicion." Lord Thomas's voice was thunderous, his rage spilling forth with venomous clarity. "You think we don't know what you've done? After Marcus's death, we found things missing. Money, jewelry. You played the grieving lover while you stole from this family." Kiara gasped, the accusation striking her like a blow. "I never took anything. I would never. How can you accuse me of this?" Lady Eliza hissed, her eyes narrowing. "You took advantage of our grief, and now you stand here pretending to be innocent." "I would never do that," Kiara protested, her voice rising in desperation. "I love Marcus. You know I did. I didn't come for your wealth. I didn't. Enough," Lord Thomas barked, silencing her. "We will hear no more of your excuses." Tears streamed down Kiara's face as she looked at the two people she had once thought might become her family. But there was nothing left of that hope. The accusations, the venom in their voices, it was all too much. Her heart ached, not just from the loss of Marcus, but from the realization that she was utterly alone. Lady Eliza stepped forward, her voice low and menacing. "You are not welcome here anymore. We will not have you sully the memory of our son with your lies. Take your things and leave. If we ever see you again, you will regret it." The finality of those words left Kiara frozen in place, her body trembling as if the ground had fallen out from beneath her. She had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. Marcus had been her anchor, her reason for hope, and now he was gone, and with him, the very people she had thought she could trust. "Please," she whispered, her voice was hoarse and broken. "Please don't do this. I have nowhere else to go. I have nothing." Lady Eliza's eyes hardened to stone. "You had Marcus, now he is gone. You have nothing." And with that, the door to the Leighton estate slammed shut in Kiara's face, the sound reverberating through the hollow emptiness of her soul. For a moment, Kiara stood there, her body numb with shock, her mind unable to process what had just happened. How had everything gone so wrong? How had love turned into this nightmare? She had lost Marcus, her heart, her love, and now she had lost everything else. The tears came then, hot and fast, streaming down her cheeks as she stumbled away from the estate. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be anywhere near the people who had cast her out so cruelly, who had taken the one thing left in her life, her dignity, and crushed it beneath their heel. Her footsteps were heavy as she fled, her breath ragged and uneven. The sky above was darkening, the first signs of a storm gathering on the horizon, but Kiara barely noticed. The world around her felt like a blur, the edges of reality fading as her mind spiraled into despair. She wandered aimlessly, the pain in her chest growing with each step, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from the lies, the accusations, the betrayal. Every memory of Marcus played in her mind, like a cruel, twisted reminder of what she had lost. The way he had looked at her, the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his arms around her. It was all gone now, replaced by a cold, crushing emptiness. By the time Kiara collapsed in a forest clearing, her legs could carry her no further. The wind howled around her, the storm finally breaking, and the sky opened up in a torrential downpour, as if the heavens themselves were mourning her loss. She sat there soaked to the bone, her body racked with sobs that she couldn't contain any longer. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than any wound she had ever known. She had trusted the Leightons, believed that they would accept her, even after Marcus's death. But now she realized just how naive she had been. They had never seen her as anything but an outsider, an inconvenience. And now, in their grief and anger, they had turned her into a villain, a thief, a liar, someone who had stolen their son from them. The rain poured down, cold and relentless, but Kiara didn't move. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The weight of her despair crushed her, until she felt as though she might disappear into the earth beneath her. For hours, she stayed there, until the storm began to ebb, leaving her soaked and shivering. The forest was silent, the only sound the soft patter of raindrops on leaves. Kiara lifted her head, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Her heart ached, but something else simmered beneath the surface now, a slow burning fury. The Leightons had cast her out. They had blamed her for something beyond her control. They had turned her love for Marcus into something ugly, something twisted. And now they expected her to vanish, to disappear from their lives without a trace. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of grief and despair, a fire began to kindle in Kiara's soul, a fire of vengeance, of retribution. If the Leightons wanted to make her into a villain, then so be it. They would regret it. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and for the first time since Marcus's death, Kiara stood, her body straightening with a new resolve. She wouldn't be broken. Not by them. Not by anyone. The Leighton family had betrayed her, but they had no idea what they had unleashed. The storm wasn't over, it had only just begun. Part 5. The Return of Kiara's Ghost. It began with the whisper of a name. At first it was so faint that no one in the Leighton household paid it any mind, a fleeting, barely their sound that could be attributed to the wind howling through the old mansion's halls. But as the days passed, that whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore. Kiara, the name echoed through the corridors like a distant play, carried on the chilling breeze that swept through the estate. Lady Eliza Leighton was the first to notice it. Sitting in her grand drawing room one evening, she heard it, a soft murmur, as though someone was standing just behind her, calling out the name of the woman they had cast away. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the dying fire. Her pulse quickened, but she shook her head, brushing off the sensation with a haughty sniff. Imagination, she muttered, refusing to acknowledge the icy dread creeping up her spine. But it wasn't just her imagination. That very night, as the house lay still and silent beneath a blanket of cold autumn fog, something stirred. Lord Thomas Leighton was jolted from his sleep by the sound of shattering glass. He sat upright in bed, his heart thundering in his chest, eyes wide as he scanned the darkened room. For a moment, all was still. Then, from somewhere down the hall, the sound came again, this time unmistakable. Glass breaking, dishes shattering against the floor. The soft, almost musical sound of something being destroyed. He threw back the covers and hurried from the room, his breath visible in the frigid air. The halls were eerily quiet as he made his way toward the source of the disturbance. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. And then he heard it. A low, mocking laugh, not loud but unmistakably clear, a sound that dripped with malice, with the promise of something dark lurking just out of sight. Lord Thomas froze, his heart stuttering in his chest. That laugh, it wasn't one he recognized. It wasn't the sound of any servant or member of his household. It was something otherworldly. He swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out along his brow as he stepped closer to the kitchen, where the noise had come from. The door creaked open on its own, as if inviting him inside. The scene before him was chaos. Every dish, every piece of silverware lay scattered across the floor, broken into jagged pieces. And in the center of the destruction, a single wine glass stood upright on the table, perfectly intact. Lord Thomas stared, his breath catching in his throat. And then, slowly, the glass tipped over seemingly on its own before crashing to the floor, shattering into hundreds of tiny shards. He staggered back, his mind reeling. There was no one here. No one had done this. Except the name that had been whispered throughout the halls, the eerie laughter that had filled the air. His thoughts turned dark, and with a sense of growing horror, he realized what was happening. Kiara, the woman they had cast out, accused, and destroyed, she had returned. From that night on, the house was never the same. The once grand Leighton estate became a place of unease, where shadows flickered in the corners of rooms and cold drafts swept through the halls, even on nights when there was no wind. The servants whispered of strange occurrences, of lights that flickered without reason, of objects that moved on their own, of footsteps that echoed in empty hallways. But it was the laughter that was the worst, always soft at first like the faintest of breezes, before swelling into something malicious, as though it was mocking them, taunting them. The servants began to refuse to work after sunset, too terrified of what might lurk in the darkness. They whispered to one another about Kiara's ghost, about how she had come back for revenge, to punish the Leighton family for what they had done to her. At first, Lady Eliza refused to believe the rumors. She was a woman of reason, a woman who did not entertain childish superstitions. But as the weeks wore on, even she could not deny what was happening. The doors in the house slammed shut at all hours, with no wind to account for it. The mirrors in her dressing room would fog over with condensation, though there was no source of heat. And sometimes when she looked into the glass, she would see someone standing just behind her. Kiara. One night, unable to sleep, Lady Eliza paced the halls of the mansion, her nerves frayed and her mind racing. She told herself that it was all in her head, that grief over Marcus had made her paranoid. But the feeling of being watched, of something sinister lurking just beyond her vision, was overwhelming. As she passed by Marcus' old room, she paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She hadn't set foot in there since his death. The pain of losing her son had been too much to bear. But something compelled her to enter now, a strange pull, as though the house itself was drawing her in. The door creaked open, revealing the room exactly as it had been left. The bed neatly made, Marcus's personal belongings undisturbed. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of the past. Lady Eliza stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. And then, as if from nowhere, the temperature dropped. A bone-deep cold settled into the room, and the breath in Lady Eliza's throat froze. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with fear, as the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She screamed, running to the door and yanking it open, but it was stuck locked from the outside, though there was no one there to do it. And then she heard it, that laugh, that eerie, mocking laugh echoing around the room, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The room darkened, and in the mirror above Marcus's desk, a figure appeared. Kiara, her face pale and ghostly, her dark hair hanging in limp strands over her shoulders. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and kindness, were now black pits of fury, burning with a hatred that chilled Lady Eliza to the bone. "You cast me out," the ghost whispered, her voice laced with venom. "You blamed me for his death, and now you will pay." Lady Eliza screamed again, pounding on the door, desperate to escape, but there was no one to hear her cries. The temperature in the room plummeted, and her skin prickled with frostbite as the ghost of Kiara stepped closer, her form flickering and shifting in the dim light. "You destroyed my life," Kiara hissed, her voice rising with fury. "You took everything from me. And now I will take everything from you." The windows rattled, the wind howled, and the room seemed to close in around Lady Eliza, trapping her in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Lord Thomas found her the next morning, curled in a corner of Marcus's room, muttering incoherently. Her hair had turned chalk white, her skin ashen, and her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now wide with terror, seeing something that no one else could. The family doctor said it was a breakdown brought on by grief, but the servants knew better. They whispered that Kiara had finally exacted her revenge, that the ghost had driven Lady Eliza mad with guilt. And the haunting didn't stop there. Night after night, strange things continued to happen. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls, growing louder as they approached Lord Thomas's room. His nights were filled with restless dreams, images of Marcus's face twisted in agony, of Kiara standing over him, her lips curled in a vindictive smile. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of brandy, the door creaked open once more. He looked up, expecting to see a servant, but no one was there. "Show yourself," he barked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, the flames sputtering as if being smothered by an unseen force. The air grew thick and oppressive, and from the shadows, that familiar laugh echoed once more. Thomas Kiara's voice was a soft, ghostly whisper. "You cannot escape me," he shot to his feet, his heart racing as he searched the room, but there was no one to be found. "You took everything from me," her voice continued, closer now, filling the room. "And now I will make sure you never find peace." Suddenly, the glass in his hand shattered, sending shards flying across the room. The curtains billowed violently as though caught in a fierce storm, though no wind blew through the windows. And then, from the shadows, Kiara appeared once more, her ghostly figure hovering just beyond the reach of the firelight. Her eyes bored into Lord Thomas with a cold, unforgiving fury. "You will suffer as I suffered," she vowed, her voice a chilling whisper. "You will know what it feels like to lose everything." Lord Thomas's hands trembled as he backed away, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the horror unfolding before him. But there was no escape. The ghost of Kiara had returned, and she would not rest until her vengeance was complete. The Leighton family had once cast her out, accused her of lies and theft. But now she had come back stronger, more furious than ever. And this time there would be no escape from her wrath. Part 6: The Failed Exorcism. The mansion was drowning in shadows. It was as though the walls of the once proud Leighton estate had absorbed all the darkness that lingered in the hearts of its inhabitants. Every room, every corridor echoed with an invisible presence. Kiara's ghost haunted the house, an omnipresent force that grew bolder with every passing day, and the Leighton family, once wealthy, powerful and untouchable, had become mere prisoners in their own home. Doors slammed shut without warning. Lights flickered and died in the middle of the night. Eerie whispers filled the silence, calling out to them from unseen places. The sound of footsteps, too light to belong to any living being, echoed down empty hallways. And always the mocking laughter, Kiara's cold, vindictive laugh chilled their bones. Lady Eliza was barely recognizable. Her once flawless skin was now marred by deep lines of fear and sleepless nights. Her sharp blue eyes had dulled, replaced by a wild, haunted look. She had stopped eating, and her clothes hung loose on her frail body. Lord Thomas was no better, pacing the estate day and night, muttering to himself, snapping at servants, lashing out in desperation. The proud, commanding man was a shadow of his former self. There was no peace, no sanctuary. The house that had once stood as a symbol of their power now felt like a tomb, and the spirit that haunted it showed no signs of leaving. The Leightons had no choice but to face the truth. They were being hunted by Kiara. The woman they had wronged now returned in death to exact her revenge. Out of sheer desperation, Lord Thomas reached out to a man whose reputation for battling the supernatural was known across the country. His name was Father Lucien. He was said to have faced demons, purged cursed spirits, and cleansed entire towns of malevolent forces. The Leighton family believed that if anyone could save them, it would be him. The night Father Lucien arrived, a sense of fragile hope flickered through the household. The servants, once too terrified to move freely after dark, huddled in the kitchen, murmuring prayers. Lady Eliza clung to the idea that perhaps, after months of torment, there was finally a way to end it all. And Lord Thomas, pacing in the grand drawing room, convinced himself that the exorcist would succeed, that he could once again control his life and banish the nightmare that Kiara's ghost had become. Father Lucien was not a man of many words. Tall and gaunt, he carried with him the weight of someone who had seen horrors that most could never imagine. His eyes were sunken and shadowed, as if the ghosts of his past clung to him still. Dressed in a long black cassock, he moved silently through the mansion, observing the way the walls seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. He could feel it, the presence that had infected the house, a darkness that lingered just out of sight, watching. "This is no ordinary haunting," he murmured, more to himself than to the Leightons. "What do you mean?" Lord Thomas asked, his voice trembling with exhaustion. Father Lucien stopped, turning to face him. His gaze was heavy, as if weighed down by knowledge too terrible to share. "This spirit is not merely trapped between worlds. It is bound to this place by something far stronger than death. It has a purpose." Lady Eliza, pale and trembling, stepped forward. "You can help us, can't you? You can banish her spirit." Father Lucien's eyes narrowed. "I will do what I can. But be warned, if this spirit's will is strong, it will fight." The exorcist wasted no time. The preparations began immediately, and the Leighton family watched in tense silence as Father Lucien unpacked his tools, holy water, a crucifix, candles, ancient texts bound in leather. He moved methodically, speaking in a low murmur as he laid salt across doorways and windowsills, creating protective circles in each room. The air grew thick with the scent of incense as the candles were lit, the flickering flames casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the grand hall, where the most activity had been reported, Father Lucien knelt and began to chant in Latin. His voice was low and steady at first, but as the words flowed from his lips, the atmosphere in the mansion began to shift. The very air seemed to tremble, vibrating with a tension that made the hair on the back of Lord Thomas's neck stand on end. The candles flickered violently. The wind outside picked up, howling against the windows, though the night had been calm just moments before. Father Lucien's chants grew louder, more forceful, as he called upon divine forces to drive out the spirit that had claimed the house. His voice filled the hall, reverberating off the walls, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then, it happened. A low, guttural laugh, Kiara's laugh, cut through the air, freezing the exorcist's chant in his throat. The sound was so cold, so malicious, that it seemed to seep into the very bones of the mansion, wrapping itself around the hearts of all who heard it. Lady Eliza gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Lord Thomas took a step back, his face pale with terror. The servants huddled together in the kitchen, too afraid to even breathe. Father Lucien's voice faltered, his chant trailing off into silence as the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the mansion into darkness. The only light came from the moon, which filtered weakly through the windows, casting long, ghostly shadows across the floor. In the center of the hall, the salt circle that Father Lucien had created began to break apart, as if an invisible hand was sweeping it away, and then, from the darkness, she appeared. Kiara. Her ghostly figure materialized at the far end of the room, her long black hair hanging in limp strands over her pale, translucent skin. Her eyes, once filled with love for Marcus, now glowed with a cold, vengeful light, and her lips curled into a cruel smile as she looked down at Father Lucien. "You think you can banish me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. "You think your prayers can save them?" Father Lucien scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling as he held out the crucifix before him. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place." Kiara's smile widened, her laughter growing louder, more mocking. The walls of the mansion seemed to shake with it, the very foundation of the house trembling under the force of her fury. "You have no power here," she hissed, stepping closer, her ghostly form flickering like a flame. "This is my domain now. I am bound to this place. You cannot drive me out." Father Lucien tried again, his voice growing desperate as he recited the exorcism rite, but Kiara's laughter drowned him out. The crucifix in his hand began to tremble, and with a sharp crack, it split in two, the wood falling to the floor in pieces. Lady Eliza let out a choked sob, clutching Lord Thomas's arm as they watched in horror. The exorcist, the man they had pinned all their hopes on, was powerless before the wrath of Kiara's spirit. "I loved him," Kiara whispered, her voice now soft, almost sorrowful. "And you took him from me. You cast me out, turned me into something I never wanted to be. And now you will suffer." The air grew impossibly cold, frost creeping across the windows, and the temperature continued to drop until every breath felt like ice in their lungs. Father Lucien stumbled back, his face ashen, his lips blue from the cold. I cannot banish her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She is too strong." Lady Eliza's knees gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs. Lord Thomas stood frozen, his face white as chalk, as the realization sank in. They had brought in the best, the most powerful exorcists in the land, and still they were helpless. Kiara had won. The spirit flickered once more, her dark eyes locking onto the Leightons, a smile of cruel satisfaction playing on her lips. "You will never be free of me," she whispered, her voice filled with venom. "I will haunt you until your last breath." With that, she vanished, leaving behind only the echo of her laughter, which lingered in the air long after she was gone. The Leighton family was left standing in the cold, empty hall, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds reeling with terror. The man they had turned to for salvation had failed, and now there was no one left to save them. Father Lucien gathered his things in silence, his hands shaking as he packed up his broken tools. He said nothing as he left the mansion, his steps heavy with the weight of failure. And as the doors of the estate closed behind him, the Leighton family knew one thing for certain: Kiara was never leaving. The mansion was hers now, and they were nothing more than her prisoners. Part 7: The chilling truth about Kiara's death. The air around the Leighton mansion had grown thicker with tension, a palpable darkness that clung to the walls and settled into every crevice. It was as though the house itself knew the weight of the secrets buried beneath it. The cold wind that howled through the estate carried with it whispers accusations from beyond the grave. Kiara's spirit had returned, relentless in her pursuit of vengeance. The family could feel her presence everywhere now. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the light seemed to signal her coming. They had tried everything: prayers, exorcisms, even desperate pleas for forgiveness, but nothing had worked. She was beyond forgiveness. But why? Why did her anger burn so deeply, her hatred so pure that not even the forces of heaven or hell could banish her? No one in the house dared to speak it aloud, but they knew. The truth had been buried for too long, hidden beneath layers of deceit, fear, and guilt. But the dead don't forget, and Kiara had come back to remind them. It was Lord Thomas who first began to unravel, haunted by the knowledge of what he had done. He had been the architect of the plan, after all, the one who had convinced himself that it was necessary. He had believed that with Marcus gone, the family's reputation was too precious to be stained by scandal. He had convinced himself that he was protecting the Leighton name, preserving their legacy, but it was a lie. The night Kiara died had not been an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated murder, one that had begun with whispers and ended with the sound of dirt being thrown onto a coffin. It was only days after Marcus's death, a night thick with rain and despair, when the truth had been set in motion. Kiara, devastated by the loss of the only man she had ever loved, had been a shadow of herself, grief-stricken, isolated, an easy prey for those who wished her gone. Lord Thomas had watched her carefully, his mind working out the pieces of a plan that would rid them of her for good. In the beginning, the idea had seemed impossible. To murder someone, let alone someone like Kiara, had felt like a bridge too far, even for a man like Lord Thomas, who was used to bending the world to his will. But fear of losing everything, fear of his carefully constructed world crumbling had driven him to madness. And so one night, in a dark, hidden corner of the estate, he had whispered the plan to Lady Eliza. Lady Eliza had resisted, but only for a moment. The idea of blood on her hands had terrified her, but not as much as the idea of Kiara remaining a part of their lives. She was a reminder of their failure, their weakness, and most importantly, their betrayal of Marcus. Lady Eliza could not bear to look at the woman her son had loved, not while knowing that their lies had driven him to his death. And so, they had set the plan into motion. They would dispose of Kiara quietly, and no one would ever know. The night they killed her was calm. Too calm, as if the universe itself held its breath, waiting for the sin to be committed. Kiara had been too weak to fight, too consumed by grief to see the treachery in their eyes. Lady Eliza had drugged her tea, whispering soothing lies as Kiara drank, her eyes full of trust. And when Kiara collapsed, unconscious, her body limp and defenseless, Lord Thomas had acted quickly. They had carried her to the crypt, to Marcus's grave. The irony was not lost on them burying Kiara with the man she had loved, the man they had taken from her. It felt like justice in some twisted way, as if in death she would be where she had always wanted to be. But it was no mercy. Kiara was still alive. The sound of the dirt hitting the coffin was the only thing Lord Thomas could remember clearly from that night. Each thud echoed in his ears, going louder and louder until it was the only sound in the world. He could still hear it now, years later, every time he closed his eyes. It was the sound of Kiara's murder. Lady Eliza had cried, not from guilt, but from fear. She had convinced herself that what they were doing was right, that they had no choice. Kiara was a danger to the family, a reminder of their downfall. If the truth of Marcus's death ever came to light, the Leighton name would be destroyed. They couldn't allow that. And so, they had buried her deep in the earth beneath Marcus's tomb. They had believed that would be the end of it, that Kiara's voice would be silenced forever, her cries for help muffled by the weight of the soil above her. They had thought themselves free of her. But Kiara had never stayed buried. The first sign of her return had been subtle. A cold draft where no window was open. The sound of footsteps in the hall though no one was there. Lord Thomas had brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of his growing guilt. But as the days passed, it became clear that this was not just his imagination. She was back, and she was furious. Her presence grew stronger with each passing day, the air in the mansion becoming heavy with her rage. She was everywhere, her laughter echoing through the halls, her shadow flickering just out of sight. The lights would flicker and die when her spirit passed, and objects moved on their own, as if driven by her unseen hand. And then came the dreams. Lord Thomas began to dream of that night, of the moment they had buried her. But in the dreams it was different. He could hear her. He could hear her screaming, her fist pounding against the inside of the coffin, begging for mercy, begging to be let out. He would wake, drenched in sweat, the sound of her scream still ringing in his ears. But it wasn't just a dream. In the silence of the night, he could hear it, the faint, desperate pounding coming from deep beneath the earth. Kiara had never stopped fighting. Even in death, she had refused to surrender. Lady Eliza fared no better. Her health had deteriorated rapidly, her body growing frail and weak. She, too, was haunted by the sound of Kiara's voice, accusing her, reminding her of what they had done. But it wasn't the dreams that broke her. It was the mirrors. Lady Eliza had always prided herself on her appearance, spending hours before the mirror, perfecting every detail. But now, every time she looked into the glass, she saw Kiara. At first it had been just a glimpse, a flicker of her reflection, standing behind her watching. But soon, Kiara's image grew clearer, more defined, until it was as if she was standing right next to her. "You thought you could bury me," Kiara whispered, her voice cold as ice. "But you only buried yourself." Lady Eliza had smashed every mirror in the house. But it didn't matter. Kiara's face appeared in every reflective surface, windows, silverware, even the still water in a cup. She was everywhere. The servants had begun to flee, unable to bear the oppressive presence that hung over the mansion. They whispered of curses, of ghosts, of revenge, but the Leightons knew the truth. They had murdered Kiara, and now she had come back for them. One night, as Lord Thomas paced the halls in a desperate attempt to outrun his guilt, he heard it again, the sound of dirt falling on wood. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was unmistakable. It was the same sound he had heard the night they buried her, but now it was louder, closer. He turned, and there she was. Kiara, standing at the end of the hall, her pale skin glowing in the moonlight. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cold and dead, staring at him with a hatred that burned through the very air. "You can't escape me," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "I will never stop." Lord Thomas tried to speak, to plead for mercy, but his throat was dry, and no sound came out. Kiara's smile widened, cruel and mocking. "You buried me alive," she said, stepping closer, her footsteps silent on the floor. "You thought you could silence me, but you can't silence the dead." As she spoke, the ground beneath Lord Thomas began to shake. He stumbled back, watching in horror as the floorboards cracked and split apart. Dirt began to pour through the cracks, filling the room with the stench of decay. And from the earth a coffin rose. It was Marcus's coffin, the very one they had buried her in. The lid creaked open, and inside he saw her, Kiara, lying still as death, her hands bloodied from where she had clawed at the wood, trying to escape. Lord Thomas screamed, but it was too late. The coffin slammed shut, and with it, the earth swallowed him whole. Lady Eliza found him the next morning, lying in the graveyard, his face pale and lifeless. His heart had simply stopped, the doctor said. But she knew better. Kiara had claimed him, and now she was coming for her. The truth had been buried for so long, but Kiara's spirit had never rested. She had been murdered by the very people she had loved, buried alive in a twisted attempt to hide their sins. But the dead don't stay buried forever. Now, as Lady Eliza stood over her husband's grave, she knew that she was next. The truth was out. Kiara had returned, and she would not stop until the Leighton family had paid for their crimes in blood. And the ground beneath her feet felt colder than ever. Part 8: Kiara's Revenge, the Leighton's Descent into Madness. The Leighton estate had always been a symbol of wealth and prestige. Its towering walls, opulent halls, and sprawling gardens stood as a testament to the family's power. But now, that grandeur was crumbling. The once pristine mansion had become a haunted place, tainted by the vengeful spirit of a woman wronged. The air was thick with dread, the kind that seeps into the bones and turns blood cold. There was no escape, no solace, only the cold, calculated vengeance of Kiara's restless soul. Kiara's revenge began slowly, with the creeping terror that invaded every corner of the Leighton home. At first it was just a presence, an unseen force that lurked in the shadows, barely noticeable. The family tried to ignore it, dismissing the strange occurrences as tricks of the mind. But deep down they knew. They had felt her return. Kiara had come back, and she was not the woman they had once known. She was something far more terrifying. Bernice's descent into madness. Bernice, Marcus's mother and the matriarch of the Leighton family, was the first to fall. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to control the family with an iron fist. But after Marcus's death, her iron will began to bend. The guilt she harbored over her son's demise festered like a wound, and it was Kiara's spirit that twisted that wound deeper until Bernice's sanity unraveled. It began with whispers. Late at night, when the house was silent, Bernice would hear a soft voice calling her name. At first it was faint, just a murmur on the wind, but as the nights passed, the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was Kiara's voice, full of sorrow and accusation. Bernice it would hiss, a chilling sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. "You took everything from me." Bernice would wake with a start, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there, yet the voice lingered in her mind, tormenting her. Soon the whispers were accompanied by visions. In the reflection of her vanity mirror, Bernice would see a figure standing behind her Kiara, her dark hair hanging limp, her skin pale and cold as death. Her eyes were hollow, filled with rage and pain. Bernice would scream and turn, but the room would be empty. Her nights were consumed by nightmares. In her dreams she would relive the night Marcus had died, only to find Kiara standing at the foot of his grave, her hands bloodied from where she had clawed her way out of the earth. "You buried me," Kiara would whisper, her voice dripping with malice. "Now it's your turn." The nightmares left Bernice trembling, unable to sleep, her nerves frayed to the point of breaking. The once proud woman became a shell of herself, wandering the halls of the estate like a lost soul. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now wide with terror, darting around as though she expected Kiara to appear at any moment. She began speaking to herself, muttering under her breath about shadows and spirits. The staff avoided her, whispering about the madness that had taken hold of their mistress. But no one could help her. Bernice was haunted not just by Kiara's ghost but by her own guilt. She had stood by and let it happen. She had let her son die, and in doing so, had unleashed a wrath that no exorcism could quell. One night, as Bernice sat in her room, rocking back and forth in her chair, she saw Kiara standing in the doorway. This time, it wasn't a vision or a nightmare. Kiara was there, her presence so real it made Bernice's breath catch in her throat. "I'll never forgive you," Kiara whispered, her eyes locking onto Bernice's. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of decay. Bernice screamed, but no one came. She was alone, trapped in her own mind, with the ghost of the woman she had wronged. That night, Bernice's mind finally shattered, plunging her into a madness from which there was no return. Mr. Leighton's despair and insanity. Mr. Leighton had always been a man of control, a man who prided himself on logic and order. But as the strange events in the house grew more frequent, even his ironclad sense of reality began to crack. He had always known there were secrets, things left unsaid about Marcus's death. He had seen the way Bernice had begun to crumble, the way she muttered to herself in dark corners, haunted by ghosts she wouldn't name. But he had convinced himself it was nothing more than grief a mother mourning her son. It wasn't until he uncovered the truth that he understood why Kiara's spirit would never rest. It began innocently enough. Mr. Leighton had been going through Marcus's old belongings, desperate to hold on to something of his son, some memory that hadn't yet faded. But as he sifted through the drawers and cabinets, he found something that didn't belong. A letter. It was addressed to him in Marcus's handwriting, though he had never seen it before. With trembling hands, he unfolded the letter and began to read. "Father, I know what you've done. I know that it was no accident that you and Mother played a role in Kiara's suffering. You took her from me, I loved her, and you stole her away. You bear the truth, just like you buried her. But I know, and one day you will pay for it." The words blurred before his eyes as the reality of what he had just read sank in. Marcus had known. He had known about the lies, the deception, and the twisted games his parents had played. They had torn his life apart, all in the name of saving their precious reputation. And now Marcus was dead, and Kiara's spirit had returned to make them suffer. Mr. Leighton dropped the letter, his hands shaking, his mind spinning. The guilt that had been festering inside him for so long began to eat away at him, consuming his thoughts. He saw Kiara's face in every reflection, her eyes burning with hatred. He heard her voice in the dead of night, whispering his name, taunting him with the truth he had tried so hard to bury. You thought you could hide it? Kiara's voice would echo through the halls. But the dead don't forget. The walls of the estate seemed to close in around him, the weight of his sins pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. Every moment was filled with the crushing weight of his guilt until his mind could no longer bear it. The final blow came when he discovered the truth about how Kiara had died. It wasn't an accident, as he had been led to believe. She hadn't simply wasted away from grief. She had been murdered, buried alive in Marcus's grave, left to suffocate beneath the earth, and it was his fault. He had let it happen. He had allowed his wife to carry out her cruel plan, all to protect their name. The guilt was too much to bear. Mr. Leighton began to see Kiara everywhere. In his nightmares, she would stand at the foot of his bed, her eyes filled with the cold fury of the damned. In the daylight, he would catch glimpses of her in the corners of his vision, her ghostly figure disappearing just as he turned to look. The house, once a place of order and control, had become a prison. The more he tried to escape the truth, the more it consumed him. And in the end, it was too much. Mr. Leighton's mind broke, just as Bernice's had. He began to mutter to himself, pacing the halls, his eyes wild with fear and madness. He would whisper Kiara's name over and over, begging for forgiveness that would never come. Kiara's wrath one by one, the members of the Leighton family fell. Bernice descended into madness, her mind shattered by the weight of her guilt and the relentless haunting of Kiara's ghost. Mr. Leighton, too, succumbed to the madness, his sanity destroyed by the knowledge of his own sins. But Kiara's vengeance was not satisfied. The family had taken everything from her, her love, her life, her dignity, and she would make sure they paid for it in full. The Leighton estate, once a symbol of power and prestige, had become a tomb. The halls echoed with the whispers of the dead, the air thick with the stench of decay. The staff had long since fled, unable to bear the oppressive presence that lingered in every room, and the Leightons, broken and haunted, were left to face the consequences of their actions. There was no escape for them. Kiara had returned not just for vengeance but for justice, and she would not stop until the family that had wronged her was utterly destroyed. In the end, the Leightons were nothing more than shadows of the people they had once been. Their wealth, their power, their status, none of it mattered anymore. All that remained was the cold, unrelenting hand of death and the ghost of the woman they had betrayed. Kiara had won. She had taken back what was rightfully hers. And now, as the Leighton family lay broken and defeated, she could finally rest. Or could she? Some said that even after the family had been destroyed, the estate remained haunted. The ghost of Kiara, it was whispered, still lingered in the halls, a silent reminder of the terrible price of betrayal. Part 9: The Curse and Eternal Vengeance. Kiara's unrelenting wrath. The Leighton estate, once a symbol of grandeur and power, stood as a darkened, hollow relic of its former self. Its tall, imposing walls now felt more like the boundaries of a prison, suffocating the few who remained inside. What had once been a sanctuary of wealth and status had become something far more terrifying, a haunted monument to a woman's undying rage. Kiara had exacted her revenge on those who had wronged her, but the story did not end there. Her vengeance lived on, as did her curse, staining the family and their estate for eternity. The aftermath of Kiara's vengeance. The day the last member of the Leighton family fell into madness, the village surrounding the estate stirred with whispers. People spoke of the curse, of the haunting that had claimed the once proud Leightons. But no one dared to speak too loudly. Fear of invoking Kiara's wrath was ever present. The mansion, once a gleaming testament to the Leightons' wealth, became a place to avoid at all costs. The villagers spoke of its eerie atmosphere, the way the wind howled through the cracked windows, like a tortured soul crying out from beyond the grave. Dark clouds seemed to permanently hang over the estate, as though nature itself had turned against the cursed land. From the moment Kiara's spirit returned, strange occurrences plagued the mansion. Fires would ignite without cause, doors would creak open and slam shut in the dead of night, and the chilling sound of footsteps echoed through empty halls. For those brave or foolish enough to step inside, it was said they could hear her voice, an icy whisper that sent shivers down the spine. "You can never escape me, the villagers. once friendly with the Leighton family, now avoided the estate entirely. The sprawling grounds, overgrown with weeds and thorns, became a haunting reminder of what happens when the living roam the dead. Even the bravest children no longer played near the gates, for fear that Kiara might snatch them away, her ghostly figure lurking in the shadows, a haunting without end. As the years passed, the curse became more than just a haunting. It became a legend passed down 2 generations of villagers. Each telling was more dramatic than the last, but at the heart of every story was the same chilling truth: Kiara's spirit still roamed the estate, seeking eternal justice. It was said that on certain nights, when the moon hung low and the fog blanketed the village, Kiara could be seen walking the grounds. Her silhouette, draped in ghostly white, would drift through the garden where she had once loved Marcus. Her face, twisted with sorrow and rage, would stare blankly toward the mansion, as though waiting for the family that had wronged her to return so she could deliver one final act of vengeance. Those who ventured too close claimed to hear her voice. It wasn't the voice of the gentle woman she had once been, but the voice of a tortured soul, demanding retribution. "They stole my life. They will never find peace," some said. They saw her pale hands reaching out from the earth near Marcus's grave, her fingers clawing at the soil, as if trying to escape the suffocating darkness of her death. Others swore they could see her staring out from the windows of the mansion, her eyes glowing with a vengeful fire that could never be extinguished. Despite the terror that gripped the villagers, no one could stop the haunting. The curse was too strong, born from Kiara's anger and betrayal. It was as though the very walls of the mansion had absorbed her fury, and now the house itself was alive with the rage that Kiara had carried to her grave. Bernice's unending torment. Bernice, the proud matriarch of the Leighton family, had fallen first to Kiara's wrath, but her torment did not end with her madness. Even after death, it was said that Bernice's soul remained trapped within the mansion, forced to relive the horrors of her betrayal. Kiara would never allow her peace, not even in death. Villagers often whispered that on quiet nights, they could hear the sound of Bernice's sobs coming from within the mansion. The once powerful woman who had ruled her family with an iron fist was now nothing more than a tormented spirit, doomed to wander the halls, seeking a forgiveness that would never come. It was a fitting punishment, for it had been Bernice who had orchestrated the plan to bury Kiara alive, silencing the woman she despised in the cruelest way possible. But Bernice's cruelty had come full circle, and now she was the one trapped, a prisoner of the very mansion she had once ruled. Mr. Leighton's endless despair. Mr. Leighton, too, had not escaped the curse. Though he had fallen into madness after learning the truth of Marcus's death, his punishment extended beyond his mortal life. Like Bernice, his spirit was trapped within the estate, unable to move on. He was tormented by the memory of what he had done, the lies he had told, and the lives he had destroyed. It was said that Mr. Leighton could be seen wandering the halls, searching for something that could never be found. His eyes, once sharp and full of pride, were now empty and haunted. His hands trembled as he clutched at the air, as though trying to grasp the truth he had buried deep within his soul. "Marcus, forgive me," his voice would whisper, echoing through the empty rooms. But there would be no forgiveness, no reprieve. Kiara had made sure of that. The unyielding curse. Though the Leighton family had crumbled beneath Kiara's wrath, the curse did not die with them. It clung to the very stones of the mansion, infecting anyone who dared to step inside. Over the years, many had tried to claim the estate, hoping to restore it to its former glory, but every attempt ended in disaster. The new owners would last only a few months before fleeing in terror, driven mad by the strange occurrences that plagued the house. Doors would slam shut on their own, windows would crack without reason, and the air would grow cold and heavy with the presence of something unseen. Most chilling of all were the apparitions. On more than one occasion, the new inhabitants claimed to see a woman standing at the foot of their bed, her long, dark hair hanging limply over her shoulders, her eyes burning with the same rage that had consumed her in life. "You do not belong here," she would whisper, her voice sending chills down their spines. "This is my home. You stole everything from me." The new owners would leave in the dead of night, unable to bear the weight of the curse that clung to the mansion like a shroud, the legacy of the curse. As time passed, the Leighton estate became nothing more than a ruin, a shadow of the power it had once held. The villagers, who had once admired the family's wealth and status, now spoke of them only in hushed tones, afraid to even mention their names for fear of summoning Kiara's spirit. The mansion, overgrown with ivy and covered in dust, stood as a reminder of the dark power of betrayal and vengeance. Its once beautiful gardens were now wild and untamed, and the grand halls where the Leighton family had once held lavish parties were silent, save for the occasional echo of footsteps that had no mortal source. But Kiara's spirit remained, bound to the estate by the hatred and betrayal that had taken her life. She had exacted her vengeance on those who had wronged her, but her rage would never truly fade. Her curse would live on, ensuring that no one who crossed the threshold of the Leighton mansion would ever find peace. And so, the legend of Kiara's curse continued to grow. The villagers would tell stories of the haunted mansion, warning anyone who dared to approach that they would be risking more than just their sanity. They would be risking their very souls, for Kiara's thirst for justice could never be quenched. In the end, the Leighton estate became more than just a haunted house. It became a symbol of the unyielding power of vengeance, of the way betrayal could twist even the most loving heart into something dark and unrelenting. And though the Leighton family had long since fallen, Kiara's curse remained, an eternal reminder that some wrongs could never be forgiven. Kiara's revenge was complete, but her story was far from over. She would never rest, not until every trace of the Leightons was erased and her ghost could finally find the peace that had been stolen from her so long ago. Until then, she would haunt the estate, a shadow of rage and sorrow, bound to the land that had taken everything from her. And so her curse would linger, ensuring that the name Leighton would forever be whispered with fear, and that no one would ever forget the price of betrayal.